Please be seated.
I always sit down. Forget.
About 17 years ago, Miroslav Volf was speaking at a prayer breakfast at the start of the 56th General Assembly of the United Nations. He presented the idea in his meditation that even, and maybe especially, in a globalized and interconnected modern world, religion could provide powerful resources for the fostering of peace. Actually, I can be quite a bit more precise about the time of the lecture. Dr. Volf was wrapping it up at 8:45 a.m. on the 11th of September 2001, the moment the first hijacked plane flew into the North Tower of the World Trade Center a few miles just to the south of where he was speaking. I don't think I need to spell out for you how much more challenging it would be to make any case for the healing possibilities of religion in our world from that moment forward. 7 years later, the same theologian participated in a council of the World Economic Forum in Dubai. The gathering was described confidently by its chairman as the world's foremost intelligence network in the biggest brainstorming session ever to take place. Now, in late 2008, of course, the crisis at hand was what a former Fed chairman was calling the worst financial crisis in global history, including the Great Depression, and a whole bunch of the smartest people on the planet had gathered to find solutions to the trouble it had brought on. But in spite of the chastening effect 9/11 had on his optimism about religion's healing potential, something about the Dubai conference left Miroslav Volf cold. There was plenty of theorizing about technological and political and economic approaches to solving a changing world's economic challenges, but Miroslav Volf felt like the real sources of this crisis weren't quite being addressed. He said, "We hardly ever touched on the dark horse of passion, which the great philosophers and founders of world religions believed pulled the chariot of the soul, often with the willing help of the white horse of reason. Arguably," he said, "what triggered the entire financial crisis was fired-up desire gone awry." The thinkers in Dubai didn't delve very far into the messy realities of our disordered and destructive desires. Maybe that's the realm of philosophy and religion. They wanted new and technical fixes to what Volf saw as ancient spiritual problems. Problems like greed. Problems like fired-up desire gone awry. They seemed to believe maybe that human beings really can live by bread alone, which is to say that there are purely material solutions to our deepest spiritual wounds and longings, but there are not ultimately. There are not. Put another way, Miroslav Volf saw the world's best minds setting themselves to the task of making lives better without pausing to reflect on what the good life actually is. If 9/11 made us rightly nervous about religion gone wrong in a globalized world, Dubai proved to at least one participant that we have to attend to matters of the heart if we're going to talk about what a flourishing human life really looks like. We still do. Which is why, perhaps in a time like ours, the old book of Proverbs may sound like urgent and late-breaking news all over again. The book begins by saying its purpose is for learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young. After teaching the Old Testament for many, many years, Professor Ellen Davis finally admitted to herself one day that her students loved Proverbs for all the reasons she kept wanting to ignore it, because the book's so ordinary. It is, as she describes it, a book for unexceptional people trying to live wisely and faithfully in the generally undramatic circumstances of daily life, on days when water does not pour forth out of rocks and angels do not come to lunch. Her students were starving for a little wisdom about what it means to live an ordinary life well. I'm wondering if we are too. And I'm wondering if a whole lot more of the world than we realize is starving right alongside us. Ordinary wisdom for living sounds like a pretty humble thing to ask of Scripture. But if we steep ourselves in the wisdom of Proverbs a bit, I think we'll find it radically disruptive to what passes for the good life in a post-9/11 world that seems to be bent on using only economic and technological tools to find it. For starters, Proverbs is really not very interested in defining the good life in terms of wealth or power. Success, it says, is about the establishment of righteousness and justice and equity. The good life involves a kind of rightness, a sense of balance and proportion in our lives. It involves right relationship with God and right relationships among God's people, not just each one of us having a little bit more. And so Proverbs makes clear that the good life can't be achieved by piling up wealth or revving up an economy or accumulating knowledge and influence. And this is a little bit hard for us to hear, I think. Because in this information age of ours, an age that believes having knowledge is about having power, we'd like to believe that the more we know, the better off we're going to be. We'd like to believe this because it is a verifiable fact that what we know about the world is increasing by leaps and bounds year after year. It is much less clear that we're any better at living well. It is much less clear that we're getting better at joy, at flourishing, to use a favorite term of Miroslav Volf. Which is to say, it's much less clear that we know any more about how to translate all this great new knowledge into a good human life. St. Augustine once distinguished between sapientia and scientia, between wisdom and abstract knowledge. He said, "True wisdom is such that no evil use can ever be made of it." He didn't think abstract knowledge about the world was inherently bad. I think Augustine wouldn't have been opposed in principle to having Wikipedia at his fingertips or knowing how to split a hydrogen atom. But he warned us that abstract knowledge can be used for good or for ill. Discernment's required. Moral reflection is necessary. There is no substitute for wisdom if we're to use what we know to actually help human beings flourish. And so Proverbs has wisdom take on the form of a woman. In our reading today, she cries out in the street, in the squares, she raises her voice. At the busiest corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks, "How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple?" Wisdom cries out to us that there's a better way to live. But we have to stop and learn her ways if we're to find it. Knowing more and having more will never quite be enough. Now, you and I happen to be in a church today. Not only that, we're in a church reading from the book of Proverbs. So maybe we are trying to be on the side of wisdom. Maybe we haven't forgotten entirely that there is more to the life God's given us than wealth and power and knowledge. But let's be real. We Christians can be as arrogantly sure as anybody else that we know just what this world needs to fix things up, right? And remember, there is a liberal and a conservative version of this moral certainty. Whether we Christians are talking about sexual mores or economic justice or any other issue in our common life, do we look more like just one more group of people wagging their fingers at the world, people who are certain they know what's wrong with everybody else's life, or do we look like a community of wisdom, a community of prayer and reflection and discernment and humility, a community steeped in this ancient tradition of sketching out a fuller picture of what it means to be fully human, created in the image of God, and then putting that image of a flourishing life out in front of us and working to make it possible for every last one of God's children to live into it. Friends, we live in a time and a place when it makes some sense to be wary of saying there are religious solutions to our deepest modern concerns. It makes some sense to be wary of offering solutions and approaches to life, even from our own Christian faith and tradition at times. But there are still no purely technological or political or economic answers to what it means to be human in this world. And as knowledge increases, it doesn't displace the need for wisdom. The need for wisdom increases right alongside it, which means that you and I may well have a gift to offer the world if we'll stop and open it for ourselves. Wisdom still cries to us from the street corners, I think. And the good news is that she's not crying out just in judgment, but with hopefulness. Hopefulness that God really has created us for joy and flourishing and goodness. God really has created our neighbor and our enemy for just the same. And don't you know, not just in your head, but in your heart, in your bones, don't you know that if we will learn to pause and heed the call of wisdom in our lives, even in the strange world we inhabit today, we can still discover a little more of the good life that every last human being was made for? Don't you know deep down that the way of wisdom is what a world overfull of knowledge may be starving for more than ever? Amen.